5 brothers walked into the land office in Lethbridge on the same gray October morning, each carrying a letter they hadn't told the others about. That was how it began, not with intention, not with any grand design, but with 5 men too stubborn to admit they were lonely, and a postal clerk named Mr. Dwight who had, apparently, been handling their correspondence with the same Legacy matrimonial agency for the better part of 6 months without once thinking to mention it. The Calloway brothers had worked the same stretch of foothills southwest of Lethbridge since their father broke that ground in 1871. 3,000 acres of short-grass prairie pushing up against the first ridge of the Rockies. Good land, hard land, the kind that made men quiet and kept them that way. Their father, Reuben Calloway, had died in the spring of 1883, and he'd left behind 5 sons, a sound house, a debt-free deed, and not a single woman on the property. Eldest was Harrington, everyone called him Hart, 34 years old, built like a fence post, not much for talking. He ran the cattle side of the operation and made every major decision by walking away from it for 2 days and coming back with his jaw set. Second was Phineas, 31, who kept the accounts and read everything he could get his hands on. He'd ordered books from as far as Toronto. He had opinions about poetry that none of his brothers asked for. Third was Caspian, 28, called Cass, who could fix anything mechanical and had once rebuilt a threshing machine from parts he found in a drainage ditch. He laughed too loud and too easily, and everyone in town liked him for it. Fourth was Dermot, 26, the quiet one. Quieter even than Hart, which was something. Dermot talked to horses the way other men talked to people, low and patient and without any expectation of response. Fifth was Obadiah, Obi, 23, the youngest, who had their mother's red hair and their father's stubbornness, and who had been ready to be married since he was approximately 19 years old, and had never once found a woman willing to move to the foothills with him. None of them had found one. That was the truth of it. The nearest town of any size was 30 miles east. The winters ran long and bitter. Women with options did not generally choose to spend February in a 2-story house with 5 unmarried men and 400 head of cattle for company. The brothers understood this. They had made their peace with it, each in his own way. Phineas with his books, Cass with his mechanical projects, Dermot with his horses, Hart with his silence, Obi with an optimism that refused to die despite all available evidence. And then, sometime in the spring of 1883, something shifted. Nobody could say exactly when. But by summer each of them had, separately and privately, written a letter to the Prairie Hearts matrimonial agency in Calgary, and by October they were standing in the Lethbridge land office with identical looks of mortified surprise. It was Obi who laughed first. Hart told him to stop. Obi laughed harder. Phineas said, very carefully, that this was not necessarily a problem, that the agency would simply match each of them with a different correspondent, and the matter could proceed in an orderly fashion. He said this the way he said most things, as though the world would oblige him by being logical, which it generally did not. They sent their letters, they received replies, and over the following months, each brother began a careful written correspondence with a woman he had never met. The first letter Hart received from a woman named Josephine Alcott arrived in February, and it was unlike any letter he'd expected. He'd anticipated something cautious, something polite. Instead, she wrote, "I will be honest with you, Mr. Calloway, because I find dishonesty wasteful. I am 26 years old. I am a schoolteacher in Winnipeg. I have red hands from cold water and no patience for men who think a quiet woman is the same as a simple one. If that is what you are looking for, I suggest you write to someone else." Hart read the letter twice, set it on the table, and walked away for 2 days. When he came back, he wrote, "I am not looking for a simple woman. I will be honest with you as well. I have not spoken more than 40 words to a woman I was not related to in the past 2 years. This is not because I am cruel. It is because I don't know how. I am willing to learn." Josephine wrote back within the week. Phineas's correspondent was a woman named Octavia Renner, 24, from a small town outside of Halifax. She had been teaching herself Latin from a book she'd found at an estate sale, and she mentioned this in her third letter almost apologetically, as though she expected to be told it was too much. Phineas wrote back 6 pages about the declension system and included, as a gift, a list of recommended texts. Octavia wrote back 8 pages. Phineas, for the first time in his adult life, felt that the world contained a reasonable number of people in it. Cass's correspondent was a woman named Tilda Birch, 22, from a farm outside of Medicine Hat. She had fixed her own hay rake twice and built a chicken coop from scratch, and wrote about both things with such precise detail that Cass had to sit down. Her letters smelled faintly of machine oil, though he couldn't tell if that was her, or the paper, or just his imagination running away with him. He suspected he was already in some trouble. Dermot wrote the shortest letters of any of them, half a page, neat and spare. But he wrote them every week without fail, and his correspondent, a woman named Vivienne Courcelle from St. Boniface, Manitoba, seemed to understand something in that steadiness that longer letters wouldn't have conveyed. She wrote that she liked horses, too. She wrote that silence didn't frighten her. She wrote these things simply, and Dermot read them sitting in the barn with the lantern turned low. Obi fell in love entirely too fast, the way he did everything. His correspondent was named Rosalind Fitch, 20 years old, from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, who had never been west of Quebec and wanted to know everything about the mountains. Obi wrote her descriptions of the Rockies at sunset that were genuinely beautiful and that he was far too embarrassed to let his brothers read. He sent them anyway. By early spring, it was agreed. The women would come. 5 women, one after another or together. The logistics were Phineas's domain, and he worked them out with a sheet of paper and 2 hours of concentrated effort. The Prairie Hearts Agency confirmed travel arrangements. The brothers spent 3 weeks cleaning the house to a standard it had not achieved since their mother was alive. They were waiting at the Lethbridge station on a Tuesday in April when the train came in. 5 women stepped onto the platform. Hart was the first to notice. He noticed because he had been a cattleman all his life, and he had spent a great deal of time observing animals moving in groups, and there was something in the way these 5 women moved together. A particular awareness of each other's position, a closeness that was not just proximity, that made him stop in the middle of a sentence he'd been saying to Phineas. He said, "Phineas." Phineas said, "Yes." "Do they?" "I see it." They looked the same around the eyes. The set of the jaw was similar on 4 of the 5. The youngest, small, red-cheeked, practically vibrating with barely contained energy, was clearly related to the tallest, who stood slightly apart from the others and watched the Calloway brothers approach with an expression that was measuring and calm. Cass said, under his breath, "Are they sisters?" They were sisters. There was a moment of confusion on that platform, which was perhaps inevitable. The station master watched with interest. A woman selling meat pies from a cart nearby stopped selling and started watching. Obi shook Rosalind Fitch's hand for approximately twice as long as necessary because he was so startled by her in person. The letters had been one thing, but here she was, actually existing, with her actual face and her actual laugh, which she deployed immediately when she saw the expression on his. The tallest woman, the one who had stood apart, the one named Josephine, introduced herself to Hart with her chin level and her handshake firm and said, "I imagine you weren't expecting this." Hart said, "No, neither were we entirely. The agency didn't say." "The agency," Josephine said, "doesn't know. We didn't tell them." There was a pause. "Why?" Hart asked. Josephine glanced at her sisters, at Octavia, with her books already tucked under her arm, at Tilda, who was looking at the wagon with professional interest, at Vivienne, who had gone quiet in the way of someone managing something difficult, at Rosalind, who was telling Obi something with her hands moving fast. She looked at all of them, and then she looked back at Hart. "Because," she said, We needed to leave Winnipeg, and we needed to leave together, and 5 women traveling under one family name would have been turned away by every agency from here to Victoria. They don't like to place sisters. They think it causes complications. Does it? Hart asked. Probably, Josephine said. But we're here now. They were here now. Hart drove Josephine back in the wagon, while the others followed with Cass driving a second rig he'd borrowed from their neighbor Greer. The road west was long, and the sky over the foothills was doing what it always did in April, threatening rain, changing its mind, delivering instead a light that turned the new grass silver. Josephine sat beside Hart and looked at everything. She didn't pepper him with questions the way he'd half feared and half expected. She just looked. After a while she said, "Your father built the house? 1871. What was it like then?" Hart thought about it. "Smaller," he said. "He added the east wing in 78. You helped him. I was 18. You remember it." He did. He remembered the weight of the green timber, the sound it made when it settled his father's hands on the plane. He hadn't talked about it to anyone. He said, "Yes." Josephine looked at the mountains, which had appeared at the edge of the horizon the way they always did, gradually and then all at once. She said, "They're bigger than I imagined." Hart said, "They usually are. The first weeks were not easy and were not supposed to be. 5 women arriving in a house is not the same as 5 women settling into one, and settling took time." Josephine established herself in the kitchen not by taking it over, but by learning it. Asking where things were kept, asking how things were done, asking with the specific attention of someone who intends to understand rather than just comply. Hart found himself explaining the pantry organization their mother had established in 1869 in more detail than he'd known he remembered. Octavia and Phineas disappeared into his study on the second afternoon and were not seen for 3 hours. They emerged looking faintly dazed and went immediately to dinner without speaking, which Phineas did not notice was unusual, but which everyone else did. Tilda asked Cass to show her the workshop. He did. She found a problem with the way he'd rigged the pulley system on the grain lift and told him so, politely but without softening it, and he stood there for a full 5 seconds processing both the critique and the fact that she was right before he said, "Want to fix it?" She did. Dermot took Vivienne to see the horses. On the 3rd morning, early, when the air was still cold and the barn smelled of hay and iron and warm animal, he showed her the gray mare he'd been training since the fall. Vivienne held out her hand and waited, and the mare came to her in about 30 seconds, which was faster than she'd come to Dermot in the first 2 weeks. Dermot watched this happen and felt something he couldn't name settle in his chest. Rosalind wanted to see the mountains up close. Obie took her as far west as the pasture road went, which wasn't far enough, and they stood at the fence line where the land began to rise, and she stared at the front range with her mouth slightly open and said, "Obie, yeah, I can't believe this is where you live." He'd never quite thought of it that way. He looked at the mountains the way you look at something you've looked at your whole life and stopped seeing. "Is it good or bad?" he asked. "Obie," she said, "it's extraordinary." He looked at the mountains again, and this time he saw them. 3 weeks in, trouble came from the east. It arrived in the form of a man named Galt. No first name ever offered, which was itself a kind of warning, who appeared at the gate on a Thursday afternoon, riding a horse that was too good for him, and carrying a letter he said was legal business. He asked for Josephine Alcott by her maiden name, which none of the Calloway brothers had heard before, because none of them had known the sisters were traveling under their mother's name. Hart met him at the gate. Galt said he was an agent for the Alcott estate in Winnipeg. He said there was a matter of a contested inheritance. He said the 5 daughters of the late Harold Alcott had disappeared before the matter could be settled, and there were interested parties who required their signatures. Hart listened to all of this without moving. Then he said, "I'll pass that along." Galt said he'd need to speak to the women directly. Hart said, "You won't." There was a silence. Galt said, "Mr. Calloway, this is a legal matter." Hart said, "Then bring a constable." Galt left. He came back 2 days later with another man, not a constable, just another man. Broad and patient-looking, in the way of someone paid to wait. They camped at the edge of the south pasture, visible from the house, which was clearly the point of it. That evening, Josephine told Hart what the matter was. She told him quietly and completely, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. Their father had died the previous autumn. Their father had had a business partner named Aldous Fenn, and Aldous Fenn had produced a document claiming Harold Alcott had signed over the majority of the estate to Fenn's holding company 6 months before his death, a time when Harold Alcott had been ill enough that he could not reliably remember his own name. The daughters had contested this. A lawyer in Winnipeg had told them, privately, that the document was almost certainly forged. The same lawyer had told them, also privately, that Aldous Fenn had friends in the city government, and that the case would not go well for them if they stayed, so they had left. "And the agency," Hart said. "5 women with different surnames," Josephine said. "We each kept the first name we'd been using in our correspondence. We didn't lie, we just didn't explain." Hart was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The deed to your father's land. Where is it?" Josephine reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and set a folded paper on the table. Hart looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "Your father signed it to you." "To all 5 of us," she said, "equally, and Fenn's document claims he signed over the company assets, yes, not the land." Josephine went still. "What?" "Fenn's document is about the company, the trading company. Your father's land deed is separate." Hart leaned forward and looked at the document she'd set on the table. "If your father's land wasn't part of the company, and from what you're describing, it sounds like it wasn't, or Fenn would have claimed it directly, then Fenn can contest the company assets all he likes. That's a business matter. The land belongs to you 5 regardless." Josephine stared at him. "I'm not a lawyer," Hart said. "No," she said, "but you are a man who's been reading land deeds since you were 18 years old." He had been. The brothers did not wait to be asked. Phineas wrote 3 letters that night, one to a land law office in Calgary he had used for the deed transfer on the east pasture 2 years prior, one to a barrister in Winnipeg, whose name he'd found through 2 letters of reference that took him an hour to track down, and one to a journalist at the Calgary Herald whom he knew slightly, and who, he told the others, might find the story of a forged inheritance document, and 5 women driven from their home, moderately interesting. Cass and Dermot rode south at first light to have a conversation with the 2 men camping on the south pasture. The conversation was brief. The 2 men broke camp before noon. Galt was not seen again that day. Obie drove Rosalind to town and back, not because she needed anything from town, but because he could tell she'd been sitting inside her fear for 3 days and needed to move through open air, and when they got back she was steadier. She thanked him. He said it was nothing. She looked at him in a way that suggested she knew it wasn't nothing, and he had to find something to do with his hands very quickly. Josephine found Hart mending fence in the north field the following morning. She didn't say anything immediately, just worked alongside him, handing posts, holding wire. After a while she said, "You didn't have to do any of this." Hart drove a staple in before he answered. "You're on my land," he said. "Whatever came after you is on my land too. That's not something I could leave alone. Is that the only reason?" He straightened up. He looked at her across the wire. He said, "No." He didn't say more than that, and she didn't ask him to. The legal matter took 2 months to resolve, which is fast. Faster than anyone expected, and the reason it went fast was that Phineas had been right about the journalist. The story appeared in the Calgary Herald in early June. Estate dispute. Follows 5 sisters to Alberta foothills, and the scrutiny did what scrutiny generally does to documents that don't hold up well in light. It clarified things considerably. The barrister in Winnipeg, now with public attention on the case, found two witnesses willing to testify that Harold Alcott had been incapable of signing any meaningful legal document in the period Fenn's paperwork claimed. The company assets went into a protracted dispute. The land remained, clearly and legally, with the 5 daughters of Harold Alcott. Galt was not found to have done anything technically criminal, which Hart thought was a failure of the legal system, but Phineas said that was often how it went, and there was something to be said for a man losing his employer's confidence and his income, which Galt apparently did shortly after. By July, the foothills were gold, and the sisters had been on the Calloway property for 3 months. And the question of what happened next was present in the house the way weather is present, not yet arrived, but on its way. Josephine raised it first. She raised it the way she did most things, directly without softening in the kitchen after supper when the others had gone outside or upstairs. She said, "We need to talk about what we're doing here." Hart said, "All right, we came here as prospective brides," she said. That was the arrangement. But the arrangement was made without everyone knowing everything, and now everyone knows everything. So I think the arrangement should be remade. If that's what people want, Hart said. Is it what you want? Josephine's hands were flat on the table again. That same gesture which he'd come to understand meant she was thinking something through and not giving it away until she had. She said, "I want to stay. I want to stay on this land. I want to be useful here, and I want this to be my home." She looked at him steadily. "I want that to be because I choose it, not because I came 3,000 miles and have nowhere else to go." Hart said, "That's a real distinction." "Yes, what would it take," he said, "for it to feel like a choice?" She thought about it. She said, "Ask me again in 2 weeks." He did. The Calloway brothers did not propose on the same day. They were not that coordinated. Hart asked Josephine first in September, while they were riding the south fence line and the aspens had gone yellow. She said yes. She said it the way she said things, without sentiment but without reservation, and that was worth more to Hart than any other kind of yes would have been. Phineas wrote Octavia a letter first, which she correctly identified as his way of being certain he had the words right, and she wrote back accepting, and then she came downstairs and told him to his face, because some things, she said, shouldn't only exist on paper. Tilda told Cass she'd been thinking about the marriage question and had made a list of relevant considerations, and the balance came out clearly in favor. And Cass laughed so hard he knocked over a water pail, and she pretended to be annoyed, and neither of them was. Dermot asked Vivienne in the barn, with the horses. He was brief. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. Obie had been waiting for months, and Rosalind knew it, and she let him wait until the exact right moment, which turned out to be an afternoon in late October, snow coming off the mountains, the two of them standing at the same fence line where she'd first seen the Front Range and called it extraordinary. And then she said, "Obie, are you going to ask me or not?" he asked her. She said yes. She said it like she meant it, which she did. 5 weddings happened over the winter, spaced out between November and February, each one small and specific to the couple, and each one attended by all of them. The house, which had been built by Reuben Calloway for a family he'd imagined, and then lost, filled up the way it had been meant to. The east wing that Hart had helped build at 18 years old turned out to be exactly the right size. The barn required a 3rd lantern because more people came and went in the evenings now. The Calloway land, 3,000 acres of short-grass prairie pressing against the mountains, felt for the first time in a long time like a place people had chosen rather than been left in. The last wedding was Dermot and Vivienne's in February in the barn because Vivienne said she'd rather be warm and surrounded by horses than cold and surrounded by nothing, and no one argued with her on this. The gray mare stood at the far end of the aisle and watched the proceedings with what Dermot chose to believe was approval. Later, when the last guests had left and the house had gone quiet in that particular winter night way, wood settling, wind coming off the mountains, fire burning low. Josephine stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark shapes of the Rockies against the sky. The same mountains she'd looked at every day for 10 months now, and thought, I know them now. I know exactly what they look like in every light. She thought, that is what it means to be home. Behind her, Hart came in from the cold, unwrapping his scarf, not saying anything, just setting the lamp down on the table and starting to bank the fire for the night. She watched his reflection in the glass, the deliberate movement of his hands, the set of his shoulders. The quiet that she had learned, over 10 months, was not absence but presence of a particular kind. She turned from the window. He looked up. "Good night," he asked. "Yes," she said. She meant the wedding, and the house, and the land, and the long, strange road that had brought her here from Winnipeg with her 4 sisters, and a deed in her pocket, and a letter from a man who'd said he was willing to learn. She meant all of it. "Good night," she said, and meant that too.